talk to you about this book. It's been my passion for years. It's been my passion for years, and I'm so happy that something got out and published. There's actually a lot more research that didn't get in the book, so I'm still working on how to get that out. I also want to thank everybody for their interest and enthusiasm. I've already received more social media coverage than I ever could have imagined, and already getting positive reviews, which I'm really grateful for, and I have a lot of you here to thank for that. So I also have a lot of you to thank for material that I used, information, ideas, questions. So I want to thank you for that too. It's also really a pleasure to be here celebrating the 10th anniversary of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. It's a project that I and several of the organizations I'm involved in have put a lot of time and effort into making sure it happened, and so it's really fabulous that it's here and alive and kicking, and that I can celebrate my book at the same time. So I stand here on the shoulders of centuries of cooperators of all races and genders, but especially of cooperators of African descent whose history has been too well hidden. And so I hope I'm uncovering a lot of it, and I hope I'm empowering the rest of you to uncover more of it. Because one of the other big secrets about the book is it's very incomplete. Almost every history, case study, documentation that I have doesn't even have the full story behind it. I don't even know oftentimes who are all the founders or who the members were. I don't even know sometimes how long the co-op lasted. I was able to just piece together information, snapshot information that I found. So these are all histories that we can all look into more, especially in our own hometowns, in our own areas where we are. There's lots of ways. If you really want to know how to look into it, ask Tom Pearson, because he's been traveling around the country, sending me stuff that he's found every place he goes, and the rest of you can do that too. So I started this journey looking into the history of African American co-ops because of my interest in economic justice and my belief that economics can and should be liberating rather than exploitative. And I was reminded about cooperatives, and so actually started to go to co-op meetings all around the country and in Canada. And when I first attended those co-op conferences and started talking to people about co-ops as an economic development strategy, that was the first problem. A lot of people didn't think about co-ops as an economic development strategy. They just thought of it as an alternative business model for people who want a good job sometimes, or people who want healthy food in their neighborhood. So that was already a task. And then when I saw people of color and started asking about participation of people of color, I got all kinds of hems and haws. But mostly, even people of color themselves told me that black people don't do co-ops. So that's the first myth that's dispelled. All of you already know that. But believe me, it was one of the first hurdles I had to overcome in getting that book done. And actually, I still have a student, a graduate student who just emailed me a couple of weeks ago who told me that she wants to study African American cooperatives, and her department is telling her that it's she wants to study cooperatives, oppression issues, and race issues in cooperatives, and her department and her people are telling her there is no issue, it's a non-issue, and why would she even want to think about that? So she's trying to get me to help her. So it's an ongoing struggle. Graduate school classmate of mine, Curtis Haynes, who you'll see I actually dedicated the book to in addition to my children, told me I should read Du Bois. And at first I didn't realize that W.B. Du Bois knew anything or said anything about cooperatives. As you guys know, he's much more known as a radical intellectual, founder of urban sociology, writing about race, advocating for the talented 10th. But I am going to read you a couple of things he said so you can see how I got really excited that maybe I was on to something. In 1933, in the Crisis magazine, which is the organ of the NAACP, National Association
the
advancement of colored people, sorry. I had a blank moment there. He wrote an article called The Right to Work in 1933. And in there, he wrote one of my favorite sentences, which is, "We can, by consumers' and producers' cooperation, establish a progressively self-supporting economy that will wield the majority of our people into an impregnable economic phalanx." And that same year, 1933, he also was one of the speakers at the famous Rosenwald Economic Conferences in Chicago, I believe, in a speech that he entitled, "Where do we go from here?" Any of you who know your history, Martin Luther King also had a similar speech, "Where do we go from here?" in the 60s, but this is 1933. And he ended that speech by saying, "It is now our business to give the world an example of intelligent cooperation so that when the new industrial commonwealth comes, we can go into it as an experienced people and not again be left on the outside as mere beggars. If leading the way as intelligent, cooperating consumers, we rid ourselves of the ideas of a price system and become pioneer servants of the common good, we can enter the new city as men, not mules." So that impelled me to try to figure out what the history was and whether we've already tried to do this, and thinking about that strategy, right, of entering the new city as men and women, not as chattel, which, if we know African American history, we spent many centuries not even owning our own bodies. So this cooperative history that I found is a retelling of African American history in general. Many of the players turn out to be the same. That's another one of the insights I gained. A lot of the great African American thinkers were also thinking along cooperative lines, acting and thinking, promoting some kind of cooperatives. Again, we don't know that part of their history, that part of their thought and practice, but once you start to look into it, that's one of the things you find out. I want to give 2 or 3 historic examples, then open it up for questions, and then I think we go to lunch. So, since we're here doing worker co-ops, the book is not just about worker co-ops, it's about any kind of co-op and any kind of economic cooperation, but focusing on formal cooperatives. But I do want to start with the relationship between the cooperative movement and organized labor, because that's also where a lot of the more formal African American co-ops start, is with the integrated labor unions in the 1860s through 1890s, which were also very much part of the cooperative movement, because those unions and organized labor organizations were realizing that just fighting for worker rights wasn't good enough. They really needed to fight for worker control and worker ownership. And so we forget that also, that organized labor and cooperatives have a code, what's that called, a simultaneous development. As early as 1836, according to John Curl, the National Trades Union, who was facing a prolonged struggle with employers, actually recommended cooperation as a solution. In the 1840s, the associationist movement produced 22 industrial cooperatives. It's 1840, so before you even had the Civil War. It's not actually necessarily all black people, but you can see what was happening in the trade unions. And then with the Knights of Labor, you actually get integrated labor movement. And the Knights of Labor are also promoting worker cooperatives. By 1880s, they had 200 industrial co-ops. Actually, 200 were organized between 1886 and 1888 alone. The Knights actually promoted women's labor movement leadership as well as black leadership. And they understood that the labor movement had to be a joint movement of women, people of color, and white workers, because otherwise they could divide and conquer. Somehow that got lost over the years, but this is the 1880s. But it was very dangerous, so they had to do a lot of things clandestinely, especially the black chapters of the Knights of Labor. Hence, the title Collective Courage because it was actually extremely dangerous, particularly for blacks, but for laborers in general, to talk about alternatives and to try to get rid of the bosses and own their own businesses. So the Black Knights, there's not that much information about them, but we know that they had cooperative villages in Birmingham, outside of Birmingham, Alabama, in the late 1880s, and there was a black-owned cooperative cotton gin in Stewart's Station, Alabama, in 1887. If we not fast forward, but at that same time, blacks actually started to form their own unions as well, and the Colored Farmers National Alliance and Cooperative Union was formed in 1886 to aid black farmers, both to own their own land, so with mortgage, and also with marketing and supplies. The colored members the Colored Alliance, members were also involved in political change. This was now the ending of Reconstruction and the beginning of Jim Crow, white supremacy rule in the South. And so the Colored Farmers Alliance was also trying to get laws changed back to the time when we had civil rights laws from the Reconstruction period. And at the same time, doing economic rights. The other thing that they realized was that you really couldn't fight for political rights unless you had economic independence and some kind of economic stability. And that's going to also become a theme in the 60s with SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and Fannie Lou Hamer are also going to argue the same thing. So we can't just vote for we can't argue for political rights if they can retaliate against us economically. So that we have to be able to own our own farms, be in control of our own companies and economics in order to do any of the other things we need to do as a people. To fast forward to finish labor movement example, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which counts itself as the first independent black labor union after the labor legislation from the New Deal. The Sleeping Car Porters and the Ladies Auxiliary to the Brotherhood both also argue similarly for the necessity of keeping money and goods flowing in black hands, particularly black labor's hands. So again, it's not good enough just to get good contracts. In their case, they're one of the best paid blue-collar black workers on the sleeping car porters, but they realize that that's not enough, right? They need to keep money circulating in the black community, keep money circulating in black labor's hands. What's the way to do that? Cooperatives. So, Ladies Auxiliary, with the approval of A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood leadership, actually start co-op study groups, give people reading lists for how to learn about cooperatives, consumer cooperation, and other cooperatives. They actually have, they start co-ops. Chicago, which is the headquarters of the Brotherhood, had the Brotherhood Cooperative Buying Club, the Cooperative Union Eye Care Center, which Ladies Auxiliary was one of the major co-founders of. In Canada, they start the Walker Credit Union, and they start other co-ops and study groups throughout major cities in the U.S. So you can see again how all this connection, right, between labor rights, worker rights, ownership, continues over the centuries. The 1930s, during the Great Depression, was actually a very active time for economic cooperative formation among, I think, everybody, but particularly for the African Americans. I found most of the co-ops in that period, 30s and 40s, and then another really prolific period would be the 60s and 70s. So I'll give you another example from the 30s and then a quick example. I might not have time for the third example. So the other group I just wanted to talk about, and it turns out I guess I'm talking more about organization efforts rather than single co-ops, but those are really important because actually in my research, I think a lot of the proliferation of co-ops does depend on strong organizations. So this is a good group to tell that to. Because we want to make sure we keep our organization strong so we can help develop as many co-ops as possible. 1930, the Young Negroes Cooperative League is started, And that started by a man named George Schuyler, I can never remember how to pronounce his name. And one of our sheroes, Ella Jo Baker. Ella Jo Baker is fresh out of college in those days. This is way before she becomes famous for her activities with SNCC or her activities as field director of NAACP. This is really where she gains her training in grassroots democratic participation in the co-op movement. So she's another one of those we can say really started in the co-op movement and learned a lot of what we know her for in the co-op movement, even though you don't always hear about that. So George Schuyler actually puts out a call. He's a columnist in the Pittsburgh Courier. Before that, he had actually been a co-editor with A. Philip Randolph in the Messenger newspaper in the 19-teens. He now says, young Negroes, it's you who must take the burden of leadership. You must succeed where the oldsters have failed. Young Negroes, turn your backs on the old programs and prescriptions and formulate others more in accord with the social and economic trends. Forget your petty individual interests and join in the cooperative effort for the betterment of all. Young Negroes, through cooperative effort as consumers, you can find your way out of the present dilemma. Collectively, through democratic management of your own economic enterprises, you can supply yourselves with everything you consume, your own amusement, recreation, your own education, and culture. And they organized their first conference in October 1931 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with 30 official delegates and 600 attendees. This is 1931. Ella Jo Baker gets elected executive director. She had been operating general secretary until then. She gets elected as the first and only executive director, and Schuyler gets elected as president. Ella closes that first conference with a discussion about the role and importance of women in the African American cooperative movement, 1931. She says, we seek to bring women into the league on equal basis with men, that where necessary, housewife leagues will be formed, and that where they are already formed, the closest cooperation possible to establish and maintain between them and the Young Negroes Cooperative League. They had their second conference in Washington, D.C. at Howard University in 1932. They established councils in major cities, let me just name them, and they have a long-term plan which they don't get to implement, but I just want to probably end on that so you can see how people were thinking. So founders and organizers came from Nashville, Tennessee, Santa Barbara, California, Mobile, Alabama, Wilmington, Delaware, Buffalo, New York, Belle Veronne, Pennsylvania, Los Angeles, California, Homestead, Pennsylvania, Covington, Virginia, Cincinnati, Ohio, Middletown, Ohio, Ellerson, Virginia, Washington, D.C., Worcester, Mass., Louisville, Kentucky, Topeka, Kansas, Dallas, Texas, Albany, New York. And officers were from New York City, Columbus, Ohio, Pittsburgh, New Orleans, Cleveland, Lansdowne, Monessen, Pennsylvania, Detroit, Columbia, and Phoenix. So you see they've really gotten all over. They were a national movement. Their plan was to get 5,000 charter members in the first year, paying a $1 fee, which would give them a $5,000 initial budget to work with. They wanted to have a forum in each community that had 5 or more members, a cooperative enterprise where each council was built out of the forums, a cooperative wholesale establishment in each state within 3 years, a cooperative bank in each community where there was a council in 4 years, and factories to produce necessities such as clothing, food, and shelter within 5 years. Now, unfortunately, they didn't reach that. But you see, they were thinking big, their reach was wide, and they had this commonwealth notion, right? So first we come together to build a local society, and then around that society we build all the things we need, the finances, the food, the shelter, the factories, the education system, that kind of thing. So it was a really comprehensive program. And Ella Baker, even though within 4 years they don't have enough money to even have an office, they operate out of her home, and then they eventually disband, but she actually goes on to be a member of other New York City co-ops through the 40s and into 1975. She's still on a co-op board in Harlem. So I think I have to stop there. I think we have time for a couple questions, but thank you all for your interest. Tool, not necessarily an end. I think they can be an end, especially worker co-ops, to me, are one of the best examples of democratic economic organization, but I also see co-ops as part of a whole solidarity economy. And so as they can help people to move into sharing economy, as they can help people gain skills to do other kinds of solidarity things, that's fine. One of the other findings, not just from me but from my work, is how important co-ops are in developing all kinds of human capital, social capital, leadership, a variety of skills that people can take and do take anywhere else in the rest of their lives, or can even take from one co-op to another co-op or to another instance. So that, because we're so good at teaching about that democratic participation, because you have to know how to run your business to participate democratically, there's lots of ways that those skills can then be used for other things. Even some of the quote-unquote failed co-ops aren't really failures because of all the things that people have learned by being a part. Right? Co-ops is really, the process is almost more important, even though we want the outcome as well. And so that process can be used in lots of other ways, but it's a good place to start. It's also a good place to end, depending on what the rest of the objectives are.
I only choose one, and I saw you first. No, go ahead. I saw you second. Okay. Can we get a mic down here in the front? Sorry, we're coordinating with the